What I'd like to do in this video is to show you how to use ZIndexMgr, which is very useful in situations where you have ZIndex values in your app that are changing at runtime. If the ZIndex values don't change at all at runtime, then you have no need whatsoever for a ZIndexMgr. You can just set the ZIndex values to whatever you want to set them to, and you're done. However, if the ZIndexes change over the course of runtime, then you may need some sort of ZIndexMgr, depending on the complexity of the situation. What I'm going to do in this video is to show you such a situation, show you an app that I wrote that I use ZIndexMgr in, show you how I use ZIndexMgr in that app, and talk a little bit about ZIndex as well. First of all, documentation of ZIndexMgr is pretty good, I think, as these things go. However, it does give you some URLs up front that you might want to have a look at, especially the first one. It's not a really long article, but it's a very good article on how ZIndex works. Not ZIndexMgr, but ZIndex in general. As a matter of fact, I got everything that I needed about ZIndex from that first article. Although, never hurts to read more, to know more. Let's start by having a look at the documentation. It says, create one ZIndexMgr to manage the ZIndex values of your main windows /layers /containers. So that's important. I mean, in web apps these days, generally, you have one HTML file, but you have multiple windows. That is, you have multiple divs that you manage the ZIndex of, in making them be in front at the right time. So yeah, create one ZIndexMgr to manage the ZIndex values of your main layers. All the windows you manage with a given instance of ZIndexMgr should have the same parent. That's an important point. If you want also to manage other windows that have a different parent, create a different instance of ZIndexMgr to manage those windows. Why do the elements that you manage with ZIndexMgr all have to be siblings? Well, that's not something about ZIndexMgr, that's something about ZIndex that you need to read about, if you haven't already, in that article, that free code camp URL. So yes, all of the elements that you manage with a particular instance of the ZIndexMgr have to be siblings. If you want to manage other elements that aren't siblings of those managed with a given instance of ZIndexMgr, then you have to create another instance of ZIndexMgr and manage those siblings separately. And I actually do that in the NeoNio app that I'll show you. I use 3 instances of ZIndexMgr in NeoNio. The CSS ZIndex property does not apply to elements whose CSS position property is the default static value. Such elements are called non-positioned elements, whereas an element that has a position property value of anything else is a positioned element. All the elements you want to manage with ZIndexMgr have to be positioned elements. That is, their CSS position property value must be either absolute or relative or fixed or sticky. Okay, so how do you create an instance of ZIndexMgr? Well, first you have to link ZIndexMgr.js to your HTML file, of course. And then here's an example of how to create an instance. Parameters are elements or their IDs. You can feed either to ZIndexMgr and it'll deal with them correctly. And these are the elements that you want to manage. There is an API for ZIndexMgr that will let you add elements later on if you want. That is, after you create the instance, you can add and actually delete them from the management by ZIndexMgr. Well, here's the API for the ZIndexMgr. You can send this element to the front of all of the elements that you are managing. You can send this element to be in front of this other element which you are also managing with ZIndexMgr. You can send this element to the back of all of those elements that you are managing with ZIndexMgr. You can make this element jump up by 4 levels amongst all of the elements that you are managing with ZIndexMgr, specifying this offset. You make the element jump up or down. And then this one lets you move this element to, say, be the first, the highest, that is. Or if rank were 2, then this element would become second highest. This gives you an array of the managed elements sorted by ZIndex. This lets you, it doesn't delete the element from the DOM, but it deletes the element from the list of elements that are managed by this instance of ZIndexMgr. Top ZIndex returns the current top ZIndex value. The ZIndex values that ZIndexMgr sets are very high, but that really shouldn't concern you. I mean, if you are manipulating the ZIndex values yourself, then you're not using ZIndexMgr correctly. The ZIndex values are supposed to be managed by the ZIndexMgr. This ZIndex list returns an array the same length as sorted window list and contains the ZIndex values of the windows. This tells you the rank of this element, like if this is the top most element amongst all of the elements that you're managing, then ZIndex element returns 0. Okay, now let's look at NeoNio. We're looking at NeoNio in VS Code right now. And we see here we have the ZIndexMgr.js file along with the documentation file, which doesn't need to be there, but is there for reference. Okay, so I'm going to start NeoNio. So this is the first layer. Everything that is currently visible is in this first layer, an introductory layer. We can go to the next layer either just by letting this finish its text, or if we click NeoNio is ready, that will also take us to the next layer. There it goes, it's finished its text. Okay, so this is the second layer, although we also see over here down at the bottom right something that we see in both verse 1 and verse 2, namely both in the second layer, which is currently visible, and the layer that we're going to view next. The logo, which is in the bottom right, is always visible. It's always topmost, and so that actually is a whole layer unto itself, as we'll see. And the way to go to the final layer is with this button, which when we click shows a different screen. Okay, so those are the different layers, and also I said that I used ZIndexMgr in other ways besides just to manage the main layers, and show you what I mean by that. If I click this, then this sound icon becomes topmost amongst all of the other sound icons. If I click, say, this one, then you see it is topmost amongst all of the sound icons. And in general, when you click a sound icon, it becomes topmost amongst all of the other sound icons. Okay, now let's have a look at the HTML, which is in this file. So down at the bottom of the file is the logo container. This contains the logo that we looked at the bottom right. And here's the v2 container, which is a sibling of the logo container. The v2 container goes from here up to here. So, you know, the v2 container is it's got some stuff in it, as we see over here. Everything highlighted is visible in blue over here. Now the v1 container is a sibling, as we see, of the v2 container. And the v1 container ends here and begins here. So it is a sibling of the v2 container. And here is the v0 container. This is the introductory layer that we looked at it, and it is a sibling of the v1 container. So the moral of the story is, yes, all of the layers are siblings, and the sound icons that I mentioned, which are in the final layer, the verse 2 layer, they are not siblings of these containers. They are contained in the v2 container. Here's where the verse 2 container starts, right here. Where are the sound icons for that verse? Well, here they are right here, and they are descendants of the v2 container. But note that all of the sound icons, which are managed by an instance of the ZIndexMgr, they are all themselves siblings, as they needs be. Okay. So now let's look at the code. Well, the code is in this nio.js. What we're looking for, of course, is ZIndexMgr. Okay, so this says that there are 3 occurrences of ZIndexMgr in this file. Here's the first one, where I create a layer manager for the animations. The next instance is where I create a manager for the sound icons. And the third is where I create the manager for the layers. Now, this looks a little different from the other 2 that we looked at, in that this feeds the parameters, namely the IDs of the layers themselves, to ZIndexMgr in the creation of the manager. As we saw in the documentation, you don't need to do that. You can add the elements later on, but in this case, we're doing it immediately. I should also note that the last parameter will be topmost. The second to last parameter will be of rank 2, rank 3, rank 4. Okay. So first we create the manager, and then I set the layer to be the active layer. This is in the beginning of the program. This is in the initialization routine. So as we saw in NeoNio itself, the first layer that we see is this v0 container, this introductory layer. So what is set layer active, it's not from the API of the ZIndexMgr. It's some code that I wrote. Let's go to the definition of that. To set a layer active, you call this, and a layer is usually the ID of the container. It's, just the easiest way to do it. You can also send the element itself, but I have this this function layer object, which takes a layer, and if it's a string, it converts it to the element. So that layer object is definitely going to be the element. And then we use the layer manager to set this layer to be the second highest. Why the second highest? Well, because we noted that the logo container is always topmost. It's always the highest. So when we set a layer active, we don't want to bring it to front. We want to make it the second highest. Okay, so we make it the second highest, and then we make the layer visible. Making layers visible or not visible is not in the wheelhouse of ZIndexMgr. ZIndexMgr is only for managing the ZIndex values. And it's very purposefully not making layers visible or invisible. Doesn't touch any of that stuff, just works with the ZIndex values. Okay, what else do we have here? Well, here's layer stuff. Set layer visible. Well, it sets the visibility to visible, and it sets the opacity to 1. Set layer invisible. It sets the visibility to hidden, and it sets the opacity to 0. Okay, so that's all she wrote concerning the layer manager. I mentioned that in verse 2 there's another use of ZIndexMgr, namely when you click a sound icon, it becomes topmost amongst all of the other sound icons. So let's look at that in the code. Here's the sound icon layer manager. So first we create it. Now we're not adding the sound icons here. We're just creating the layer manager. So now let's search the code for this term and see what shows up. Okay. Well, I happen to know that this is where we add the sound icon to the ZIndexMgr, to the v2 sound icon layer manager. So what's going on here? Well, this file, this v2 sound icon.js file, the whole thing is a long JS constructor that constructs this object, constructs a sound icon, and the last thing that is done in this long constructor is to add the sound icon to the ZIndexMgr that manages the sound icons. And then what's this? Well, this is sending something to front. This is when the pointer goes down on the sound icon. Sure enough, we send it to front. Okay, that's more than you wanted, isn't it, on the ZIndexMgr? But now you know.